Good morning. Angela Duckworth has rewritten the rules of the game on education. According to one report, when she applied to the PhD program at Penn, she wrote that her experiences working in schools left her with a very unconventional view of school reform, one that I'd add we all need right now. The problem, she wrote, is not only the schools, but the students themselves. And here's why. Learning is hard. True learning is fun, exhilarating, and gratifying, but it's also daunting, exhausting, and sometimes discouraging. To help chronically low-performing but intelligent students, she wrote, educators and parents must first recognize that character is at least as important as intellect. Angela and I were just talking about the definition of a character, which doesn't necessarily suggest that you're going to be talking about one of the words that she has helped make famous and has truly helped transform the learning and teaching process, which is grit. And in fact, when you're about to hear Angela, in rewriting the rules of the game for education from which we all can learn, will tell all of us how we truly can make sure that every day in America, children don't just wake up to systems that underperform and expect only 40% achievement from them, but truly allow them to overperform, overdeliver, become amazing adults, productive human beings, and civic leaders full of character. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Angela Duckworth, CEO and founder of the Character Lab.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction. Thank you for having me to ASU GSV. It's my first time, but I hope not the last. I was, like all of you, a student. I was, like all of you, a kid. And when I grew up, I had this very dominating father who repeatedly reminded me that I was not the most talented person he had ever met. Maybe not as talented as he hoped his kids would be. And it did leave me with a lifelong fascination, I think, with achievement and with doing something in the world that would be worth noticing. And where I diverged from my father's view of the world, and many others, I think, is that I discovered through personal experience and also through scientific research that there is an enormous role for effort in doing anything great in school or out of school. So let me share a bit of the research on grit, and in particular, how I think actually, if I could go back and revise my graduate school application, it's not just that, in fact, maybe not really that students are quote unquote the problem, but really that schools need to do a much better job of helping kids develop the capacity for hard work and grit. And honestly, when I say character, I mean much more than even those things. Curiosity, gratitude, empathy, compassion, forgiveness, and many other things that we need to live good lives for ourselves and for others. So let's begin with grit, though, and say more about what it means. Here are items from the grit scale, and just for a moment, read them and answer them for yourself. I'm a hard worker. I finish whatever I begin. Kind of obvious aspects of grit. You don't need me up here on stage to tell you about them. But let me flash up two other items. What about projects that take a long time to complete? How interested or passionate do you maintain your focus on those? What about continuity over time in your interests, a through line that doesn't change even if the individual to-do lists do? When I say grit, I don't just mean being a hard worker and being resilient when bad things happen. I also mean, as I often ask the person sitting next to me on the plane or the train, I also mean, do you love what you do? And do you, in some way, stay in love with what you do? A kind of sustained passion that matches that perseverance. And I do think schools have a role in helping kids develop both this work ethic and resilience and the discovery and the deepening of something that you love so much that when a stranger sits next to you on a plane and turns to you and out of the blue says, "So, do you love what you do?" then you can nod in the affirmative and say, "Absolutely." Here are data on grit, this combination of perseverance and passion. I've got the millennials on the far left there. You'll notice, with perhaps no surprise, at the bottom of my data sets in passion and perseverance. You know, as you move to the right, the adults get older and the grit goes higher. You can take two views of this graph. One is that millennials are a victim of their generation culturally, and with all the influences on them, social media and cheaper and cheaper junk food, they have been handicapped, if you will, in their sustained passion and perseverance for long-term goals. But the other view of this is actually much more grounded in science, and that is to say that when scientists study the development of human beings over their life course, and they do better than I did, this is a snapshot of adults. There have been studies that are movies. They follow the same people for decades. What you find is remarkable change, that as we move from our 20s to our 30s and onward, we change. And generally, we change in good ways. We become nicer. We become much more empathic, though there are exceptions, of course, wiser, more dependable, conscientious, and if this graph matches that preponderance of data, we may become more gritty. And that, to me, is, as the scientists would call it, the maturity principle, what we're all after in education. We want to see this growth, but we also want to see it on a faster timetable than might otherwise take place. So yes, people change. Yes, kids grow up in generally good and positive ways, but can we, knowing something about what that looks like, accelerate that development? That, to me, is my entire life's work. I will go to my grave trying to reverse engineer good and great lives so that we can accelerate what would probably naturally happen, at least to some extent, for all of us. My favorite psychologist is from my hometown of Philadelphia, also an award-winning musician and actor, Will Smith. In this interview, he's asked simply, "Why have you been so successful?" Let's listen to Will Smith.
The only thing that I see that is distinctly different about me is I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill, right? I will run.
You would not be outworked.
I will not be outworked,
Right.
period.
Yeah.
You know, you might have more talent than me, you might be smarter than me, you might be sexier than me, you might be all of those things. You got it on me in 9 categories. But if we get on the treadmill together, right, there's 2 things. You're getting off first, or I'm going to die. It's really that simple.
Much less fun to look at or listen to or even think about is Francis Galton, who about 150 years before that Will Smith interview made a strikingly similar observation. Now, Will Smith is a very nice guy. Galton was not, but I do have a PowerPoint slide devoted to him because he was the very first scientist to systematically study high achievement. He, too, wanted to reverse engineer, as it were, high achievement, and his conclusion, which overlaps a lot with what Will was saying, is that ability or talent or IQ or smartness, they're not the same thing as sustained effort, staying on the treadmill. In Galton's words, the truly eminent have ability combined with zeal and the capacity for hard labor. In my words, talent combined with passion and perseverance. Now, you may not have heard of Galton, but you surely have heard of his cousin, Charles Darwin, who wrote this handwritten letter to his cousin after reading the scientific report. He began it, "My dear Francis, you've made a convert of an opponent in a sense, for I've always maintained that individuals did not differ much in intellect, but only in zeal and hard work." Darwin continues the letter by saying, "You've made a case, I think, that people must not be all the same ability. Some must be more able, more gifted, more naturally, quick learners than others. But he then closes the letter by saying that in his personal life experience and in his lifetime of observation, it is zeal and hard work that make the more important difference. What I want to underscore here is that there is such a thing as talent, I think, but there's also such a thing as grit, loving what you do and working incredibly hard at it day after day, even when there are setbacks, for a very, very long time. And they're not the same thing. In my data, the correlation is 0 between measures of talent like IQ and measures of grit. And sometimes it's even weakly negative, suggesting that those more able people, the more talented, as Will Smith might say, are not the ones who are staying on the treadmill the same amount of time. They may even be staying on less time than others. Here's my theory of human achievement, all on one PowerPoint slide. I think there is such a thing as talent, and I'm going to define it the way Will Smith does, which is it's, this kind of natural ability to get better faster than other people. And I want to admit that I think that there are differences in talent among us. We're not all exactly created equal in our abilities. But we've all known people who had tremendous talent and never did anything with it. In fact, there are people who had tremendous talent that we may remember growing up with who never invested enough effort to even turn that into skill, who maybe never invested enough effort to demonstrate mastery in that thing that they could have been great at. And I have this second equation here because I don't think skill's enough. Once you can do something, once you know how to lead a meeting, once you know how to write a great essay, you have to actually apply effort a second time. You have to actually take that human skill, apply effort, and do something, change something, achieve something. I am still a university professor, and in my line of work, the thinkers are the ones who are celebrated. But I can tell you personally that it is the doers in the world that demand, I think, the most respect, because they go out and they learn a skill and they constantly improve, and then they apply that skill to some urgent problem. And with that effort, they achieve something and they make the world a different and better place. So when my own 2 daughters come home from school and they tell me about somebody in their math class or on the track team who is more talented than they are, who gets things so much more easily or quickly than they do, I remind them that, of course, talent counts. But in this specific sense, unlocking that talent and turning it into skill, unlocking that skill and turning it into achievement, effort counts twice. Now, if I ask you, what is the 10,000-hour rule? I'm sure at least half of you know, which is that the modern science on high achievement, when you study the outliers, like Francis Galton did 150 years ago, that you find that they've done 10,000 hours of practice. But I'd like to let you know that it's not really true that what makes world-class performers different from others is 10,000 hours of practice. I mean, just do the math. If you actually stay in the same job for even a decade, you will, in theory, have developed over 10,000 hours of practice in that job, but it's obvious that not everybody is world-class in what they do. The 10,000-hour rule is actually not so much about the quantity of practice. The modern science of outliers and high achievement reveals that it's 10,000 hours of a different kind of practice. It's a kind of high-quality practice that I think has powerful lessons for everybody in this room, because everybody in this room is trying to improve, and everybody in this room cares about education. And when I describe to you, on the next slide, what this deliberate practice of true experts looks like, and you just compare it side by side to schooling, to what the day in a life of a middle school, high school, elementary school, any student in this country, you'll see that it's shockingly different, astonishingly different, and that there's an enormous gap here if we want to help kids to achieve their potential, to stay on this learning curve to expert excellence. Now, there are 2 other possibilities, and I think the second one here, this plateau, I call it, of arrested development, where you gain a skill in the first couple of months or years, and then you plateau, is dramatically more common than continuous improvement over the entire life course. When you do something at first and you get better, and then at some point you get comfortable, you have plateaued on this arrested development trajectory that I think is all too easy in a world where if you come in on Tuesday and you more or less do what you did on Monday, nobody thinks anything differently of you. And there's nothing unethical about the plateau of arrested development. I just think it's a little tragic that you could have done more, you could have kept learning, and you didn't. So before I tell you what the 10,000-hour rule really means, I will just say that it is possible to do 10,000 or even 50,000 hours of practice and stay on the plateau of arrested development if you're not practicing like experts do. And in fact, when I describe this plateau, the image that comes to my mind is what schooling is like for most kids, because it is not structured in the way that it ought to be. And then finally, dropping out. I think kids should drop out of things. I hope they drop out of things. I hope people drop out of things as they choose what they're going to do. You cannot get great at anything without dropping out of a lot more things. I was a mediocre piano player. It is good for me and the rest of the world that I dropped piano. Ditto for many other skills and competencies that I started down the path of expertise, but dropped out. But what I do worry about is this. I worry about kids who have never learned to stick with anything for a long time. I worry about people quitting on bad days when they are temporarily discouraged and disappointed. So we should acknowledge that dropout is a good thing, but at the same time, we should know that when an individual of any age drops out of anything, there is a cost, and that is that they will lose the skill that they were acquiring. The human brain and the human mind are use it or lose it. And when you drop out, you're not even on the plateau of arrested development. So do drop out, but do drop out with intention and learn at some point in your life to stay with something beyond the point of just being okay. What is this kind of practice that 10,000 hours over the course of years, even a decade or more, adds up to world-class excellence in chess, in ballet, in mathematics, in medicine, in every field that has been studied in expertise? There are 4 elements. Each of them are blindingly simple, rarely done in combination. And again, in formal schooling and even in the workplace, still, I think, a rarity. The first is that you have to be working on something very specific, an aspect of your performance that you can articulate maybe only to other people who do what you do because it's so technical. If you ask Katie Ledecky, what are you going to do in the pool today, she's not going to just say, like, swim, and she's not going to say just swim faster or swim harder. There's something that she's working on, a sub-skill, if you will, and she's working on it with intention. She's working on it in a kind of hyper-conscious way, knowing what it is that she's going to do. When my own daughter comes home from school and I ask her, what's homework? And she says, page 37 evens. And I say, but what's the goal? Like, what's the learning goal? What's the skill that you're working on? And she looks at me, blankly and says, page 37 evens. Then I know she's not doing deliberate practice. There has to be a very concentrated and deliberate goal in mind. Second, there's attentional focus, real energetic effort, undivided concentration. And then there's feedback. Again, if you line up traditional schooling or workplace development and what this kind of deliberate practice portrait is showing us, where is there the feedback loop that is immediate and information rich? I think from my own teaching days, I did a pretty crappy job of giving my kids the kind of immediate information rich feedback that would have optimized their learning. And I also think that we can all do a better job of this in schooling and workplace development today. Finally, fourth and probably the most difficult from a psychological point of view is to get that learner into the mindset that it's okay that they didn't get everything right. It's all right that what they just did deviated from the mental model in their head of what they wanted to do. there needs to be a reflection, an honest accounting of what I did versus what I wanted to do, and then an adjustment, a refinement, and then the entire cycle repeats itself. These are the 4 steps of deliberate practice. I really believe that any human being, whether you're Katie Ledecky or not, can do them. I also believe that in combination, they're tremendously rare in schooling and beyond. Set a goal, concentrate with undivided attention, get feedback, learn from the feedback, make a refinement, and do the whole thing over again. What does it feel like to do this kind of practice? Martha Graham, the great American dancer and choreographer, would suggest that it's not only that we need the opportunity to do this, we need the courage, because dancing appears glamorous, easy, and delightful. But the path to the paradise of the achievement is not easier than any other. There is fatigue so great that the body cries even in its sleep. There are times of complete frustration. There are daily small deaths. And this is the part of my graduate application that I would stand by today. Learning and getting better at things and accomplishing things that matter to the world is just not easy. There are times of complete frustration. There are disappointments that are so crushing, they do feel like small deaths. And there is, of course, almost always tremendous effort and fatigue. If you ask a speller like Carrie Close, who won the 2006 National Spelling Bee, when I went to study the finalists in the Bee, what it's like to prepare for a competition like that, she will describe to you a path that sounds eerily similar to Martha Graham. And in fact, we asked 175 spellers in this national competition to keep diaries of everything that they did in preparation in the months before. And they described deliberate practice as well as 2 other kinds of practice. And here I think we need to underscore the mission of schools, which is to allow kids to do this kind of practice, but also to support them, because it is actually incredibly difficult. Let's begin with a kind of practice that is not deliberate practice. It's just reading for fun. Spellers like Carrie Close rated reading for pleasure as about as effortless and enjoyable in the moment as, quote, eating my favorite foods like ice cream, unquote. So this is one way that you can spend your practice time. You can also get quizzed by mom or dad. Mom or dad might say, Ursprache, 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 the winning word for Carrie Close in the spelling bee that year. Not quite as fun and a lot more effortful, but in their diaries, when we coded for deliberate practice, working with intention on one thing they couldn't yet do with focus and feedback and repetition, drilling particularly on weaknesses, often alone for full attentional focus, we find that Carrie Close and others described it as more effortful than anything else they did, and in the moment, not quite as enjoyable or fun. If you then ask the data, which of these kinds of practice really predicts who's going to develop the skill of spelling by the end, as rated or measured by final ranking in the Bee, and how is grit or other character and personality strengths, how are they related? You find this very simple story. The strongest relationships that we found in the data were this. Grit, passion, and perseverance predicts doing more hours and minutes of this not so fun in the moment, very difficult practice, and that was the best predictor of overall spelling skill and performance. So I study passion and perseverance because it is the hallmark of high achievers in every field that I've encountered, and I study it because it keeps you on that learning curve for life. It keeps you constantly improving, even if that improvement requires some sacrifice, even if it is not the easiest thing that you could do in the moment, and certainly not the most enjoyable or fun thing to do in the moment either. What about dropping out? To study dropping out, that thing we must all do, but we should not do in moments of temporary discouragement or disappointment, I went to West Point. West Point is the military academy that provides 25% of the officers to the U.S. Army, and is kind of like getting into an Ivy League school, but harder, because these are typically valedictorians and salutatorians with top test scores. And they are also typically varsity athletes, very often varsity athletes in 3 sports, and very, very often varsity athletes in 3 sports and captains of all 3 of them, while also being the valedictorian, if not also the prom queen. So these are extraordinary young women and men. And what fascinated me, as has fascinated West Point generals going back for a half century or more, is the fact that this admission process, which takes about 2 years from end to end, results in women and men who clearly can handle West Point, but many of them dropping out after that 2-year admissions process within the first 2 months. If you collect grit scores, passion and perseverance on the scale that I showed you a bit of at the beginning, on day 2, the day that the guys get their crew cuts, and then you wait around to see who is making it through, who in fact finishes that first difficult summer of training, the summer that for the first time in your life maybe, you're not number 1 or not even number 2. You're in fact below average for 600 of these cadets. You find that those who are higher in grit are much more likely to make it through, to be showing up at the end of the summer of training. What about talent? I mentioned that talent and grit are not correlated at all in my data. I find that at West Point. And I find, too, that this measure of talent that they call the whole candidate score, it's a weighted average of your SAT scores, your high school rank, your physical talent as measured by things like the 2-mile run and your leadership potential. There is no correlation in this data set, and strikingly little relationship even if you collect more data from West Point over years and years, which I have, with showing up. It's a great thing to be talented. It's a great thing to learn faster and more easily than others, but it is not a guarantee that on the day you come to something that you cannot do with flying colors, that you are not easily at the top of your class, it is not a guarantee that you'll persist, and that you'll maintain that commitment, and that you'll finish what you began. What about showing up in sales, graduating from the Chicago public schools, and on the far right, finishing the training of the Green Berets? In all of these different settings, we studied grit, measured it, and then waited around for 6 months to over a year later and asked the question, who is showing up? And who has dropped out. And consistently we find that those with passion and perseverance are the ones who are sticking it out and not dropping out on a bad day. Happiness matters, I hope, to all of us. It's not obvious that someone like Angela Duckworth would care about happiness, but in fact, Angela Duckworth would like to be a happy person, and she would like her daughters and her family and the people who work with her to be happy too. Here's a graph of life satisfaction, overall happiness with your life, and grit. You find, in fact, a strong relationship suggesting that though there are certainly exceptions, people who love what they do and work very hard at getting better at it, even when it's not the most fun thing in the moment, even when it's incredibly effortful and involves frustration and disappointment, are overall pretty happy with their lives. So if I've convinced you that grit is not the same thing as talent, and that it's at least as important, and it leads to things like developing skill and achieving things that help other people, and also can make you very satisfied with the life that you're leading in the meanwhile, then you might ask the question, how do I build it? And what can we do? Going back to revising that graduate school essay, what can we do, not to blame students for lacking it, but to support them in developing it? Here are 4 recommendations based on research. The first, developmentally, I think is the most important, which is that nobody I have ever studied is great at what they do if they're not curious about it, if it doesn't interest them. Here I diverge from traditional tiger mom parenting advice by saying that kids should begin with interest and curiosity. I could show you another graph today which graphs curiosity over the formal schooling career. It starts in 5th grade when kids are able to answer questions like this and goes to 12th grade, and it's just a ski slope going from the top left to the bottom right. I think there's an enormous and urgent need to help kids discover and deepen personal interests throughout their schooling, so that the ski scope goes the other way, so that constantly, as kids graduate from one year to another, they know more and more about what they care about. Like Marie Curie, winner of the Nobel Prize, not once but twice, in chemistry and physics, who maintained and in fact deepened an interest in the physical world from childhood onward. So the first recommendation is that schools should honor and structurally make possible the discovery and the development of interest. Second, there is this element of deliberate practice that I focused on. Not easy, as Martha Graham would remind us, but also not impossible. There are reasons to believe that kids think that success and expertise is glamorous, easy, and delightful. There are thousands of YouTube videos of highlight reels of world-class performance. There are almost no YouTube videos of boring, mistake-ridden, anonymous practice. When you teach kids that real expertise comes from thousands of hours of trying to do things you can't yet do, and feeling a little stupid, and looking a little clumsy because you can't yet do what you're doing, but you're focusing 100%, and then someone tells you what you did wrong, and then you have to listen to it, and then you have to try again. That is the science of deliberate practice that can be shared. And when we did that with middle school and high school students, we found that particularly those who were struggling increased the amount of practice that they voluntarily did and raised their report card grades according to official school records the following marking period. No miracles were pulled. If you follow them for another marking period, the gains start to fall off to non-significance, and they begin to drift back down to where they were. So I don't believe in miracles, but I do believe in science, and I do believe in kids learning and having it reinforced to them that practice is the royal road to expertise, and they can do it, but it's not easy. And in fact, that if they keep practicing like this, they'll constantly get better instead of plateauing, and they may not at that point even want to drop out. And then there's purpose. If you ask me what the complement to interest is, what happens when someone is all grown up and says to me on an airplane, "I love what I do," it's not just that they have a childlike curiosity, it's also that what they do, what you do, has meaning to you. And when I ask you, what does it mean that it has meaning to you? Like, where does the purpose come from? You will invariably begin at some point to talk about other people. You will begin to talk about how your work in some way makes the world a better place for someone who is not you. Meaning and purpose. Here's a graph of purpose, a desire for connection to other people, and a desire to improve the lives of others, and grit scores. It's about as strong a statistical relationship as I've ever discovered in any of my data sets. And it might seem obvious, but there is a different way to live life, and that is to focus on pleasure, on comfort, on how many PTO days there are, on whether the Diet Cokes in the kitchen are free or not free. Do I have to pay for them? And this kind of obsession with comfort and ease and, the creature comforts that, of course, we all enjoy is not antithetical to grit. In fact, the straight line tells you that you can love your glass of red wine and your dark chocolate and be gritty. You don't have to be a monk to be gritty. But the flat line also tells you that if we encourage that kind of thinking and that kind of motivation, we're not doing much to encourage having true passion for what you do, and then that perseverance that comes along with it. So, curiosity and interest, deliberate practice, a sense of meaning and purpose. Finally, what my idol, Carol Dweck, would tell us, the mindset that people change. The mindset that abilities that seem fixed when you cannot do what you're doing, that seem like you have it or you don't, that seem completely innate or inborn, are in fact developable. This graphic, courtesy of Carol Dweck, tells us that a growth mindset enables us to overcome challenge because the rational thing to do, if you believe that your abilities can change, is to rise to the occasion when you're challenged, to learn from your mistakes, to embrace risk-taking. The opposite, Carol has found in over 3 decades of research, is a fixed mindset. The idea that people don't really change. You're a math person or you're not. You're a people person or you're not. You're a natural athlete or you're not. The rational response to challenge, if you have a fixed mindset, is to shrink, to hide, to cut your losses. And in fact, this is what Carol and I find in our joint research, that individuals of any age who have a growth mindset are more likely to have passion and perseverance for what they do. Now let me end with a note about other people. Here is an interview of a swimmer who made it to the Olympics and was very successful. But when he recalled what it was like to be just a young boy, he said, "At 11, I wanted to bag it because I was doing very badly. My dad at that point did something that was very important. He said, 'If you want to quit, it's fine. But I don't want you to quit simply because you're losing. So I'm going to continue to drive you to workouts and force you to swim. And once you turn 12 or at the top of your age group, you'll start to do well. If you want to quit then, that's fine.'" The interviewers in this case were psychologists at the University of Chicago, led by Benjamin Bloom. And Bloom and the other interviewers wondered, is this a case of coercion? I mean, they didn't have the words then, but I think they would have said tiger parenting. And the swimmer hastened to correct them. He said, my parents always told me that what I'm doing is my deal. It's just they didn't want me to quit on a bad day. And I will tell you that I have never interviewed a paragon of grit, whether they're a 300-pound linebacker or an intimidating CEO, who didn't have a story like this. Every kid in school and every human being on the planet needs somebody who loves them enough to not let them quit on a bad day. Grit is not being invincible. Grit is actually being able to be vulnerable and to be helped by people who love you. And finally, let's end with a little football and a little culture. If anything has given me a growth mindset, it is the idea that I can actually read the sports pages and know something about what's going on. When I got a call from Pete Carroll, he told me that part of grit is culture. Part of grit is having a microculture where passion and perseverance are honored. Let's listen to Pete Carroll.
Now, you just said something about learning how to deal with individuals and looking for a certain person or a certain type person. I know when I was at the Niners, you were there. It meant something to be a Niner, not a football player. When you and John Schneider are looking for a player, tell me, what is that philosophy? What does it mean to be a Seahawk? What is that player that you're looking for?
I'm not going to give it all to you, but
come on, man, give it to me, Pete.
I would tell you that we're looking for great competitors. That's really where it starts, and that's guys that really have grit and the mindset that they're always going to succeed. They've got something to prove. They're resilient. They're not going to let setbacks hold them back. They're not going to be detoured, by challenges and hurdles and things. That mindset that really could be interpreted like you have a chip on your shoulder. I mean, we have so many guys that have something to prove. It's that attitude, and we really refer to it as grit. That's when you have that, you overcome a lot, and it makes you a really competitive guy. So that's the basics I'll tell you about it.
So to summarize, I was a little girl who grew up thinking maybe she wasn't the most talented girl in the family or the room, but she did have the potential to do something on this planet that might help other people. I grew up as a scientist to discover that, in fact, the effort we put forth to the things that we care about is not at all handicapped by or limited by our natural ability. I further learned that you can develop these capacities. You can become grittier. You can accelerate natural maturation. And one way to do it is to reverse engineer those who are the farthest down the path. And you discover that they have interests. You discover that they have a routine of practice. You discover that they find purpose and meaning in what they do. You discover that they maintain a mindset of growth and resilience in the face of challenge and disappointment. You discover that people who are gritty have someone in the world who loves them enough not to let them quit on a bad day. And you discover that the grittiest leaders among us forge cultures where all of those things are honored and all of those things are valued. I think that there is enormous potential in every single child on this planet, and there could be nothing more important than the work of ASU, GSV, and the work that you are doing. Thank you so very much.
All right.
So I believe our rock stars need not much introduction. They are well known, and so we will try to stick to some entertaining, engaging, and relevant content. We have in this audience leaders in the education community who are committed to making a difference in education and in the lives of humans and our society. We have for-profits, we have nonprofits, we have investors, and leaders of education institutions, not only around the country, but around the globe. So, you know, and everyone has been attending this conference for years, but everyone has been at it for a long time. So it begs the question, why are we still here to make sense of it all? I'd like to maybe address some of the barriers to progress. What are the levers that we could collectively pull that would accelerate some of this transformation? Maybe pose a question, if we were given a timeline to make positive change in the next 1,000 days, what would we do? And I think the answer is self-evident, but who is responsible? Is it industry? Is it academia? Is it government? Or is it all of the above? So this unique opportunity is to get the perspectives from a former top policymaker, from a leader of one of the world's leading research academic institutions, and from the chief executive of the world's largest private education company. So I guess just a very quick sort of level set for context. For a very diverse audience, I'd like for everyone on our panel to just maybe spend a minute and say, from your perspective, meaning a leader in your respective industries, what do you do well and what do you do poorly?
In the public sector, and I speak for the public sector today, I think the leaders, the elected leaders, the CEOs of a public charity, we all do the decision-making well, especially in education. There isn't a governor or a senator or a president ever in the history of this country who hadn't said, I love education, I'm for education. And we all have an education initiative that we plug and we fund and we start. And we're so excited about what's going to happen to real people in your state or your country. And then, after all that's done, you walk away to the next set of issues, Brad, and you leave it to the bureaucracy to implement the whole initiative. One of the first things I learned in public service, because something I did was pretty badly screwed after it was trying to be implemented. And I went over and asked the Department of Education, what is going on? And this woman had the audacity to say to me, you don't know the difference between a you be and a we be. You be gone in 4 years, we be here forever. So we do what we want to do. That's what we do poorly.
All right.
It's true, I'd be gone.
But you're here now, which we appreciate. I taught at Stanford for about 30 years, and I noticed out front we are number 2. So we try harder in academia and at our institution. I think across the board, we're good at thinking. That's what we do as academics. If you want someone to sit in a dark corner and think hard about something for a few months or a few years or a few decades, go to a university and you'll find somebody who can do that. So we pride ourselves on being deep thinkers. We also get kind of narrow because we all try to distinguish ourselves individually from our peers and academic competitors, but we're good at deep thoughts. Another thing that I discovered on the other side of it when I took on a leadership role about 6 years ago is we're not very good at institutional change. We as academics are really big on being forward-thinking and adaptive in our academic fields, but the structure of the university, the structure of most educational institutions is a really complicated kind of equilibrium point in which we really don't know how to change any of the factors that are involved. The synergy between teaching and research, the way that someone's salary is cobbled together from different places, the combination of internal and external academic community rewards, those are all, they've evolved to a point in which we understand how to go forward in the way that we've been before, but we really don't understand institutional or sector-wide or dramatic change at all.
Okay. Thank you. So, Brad, you asked us to be candid.
Please.
And you asked us to be industry-wide rather than company-specific. Important point in bearing in mind what I'm going to say. Secondly, in the spirit of this event, allow me to rephrase the second half of your question. So rather than what do we do poorly, what can we learn and what can we do better? What do we do well? We'll just look around this room, look at the passion, look at the talent, look at the overwhelming sense of purpose of people who are dedicating their lives to how we can deploy technology to personalize and adapt education to empower and transform the life chances of millions of people who've not had the opportunities in life that we've had, and look at the innovation, the investment, and the commitment to disrupt and to change. All that is absolutely fantastic. But on what could we learn and what could we do better, those qualities that enable you to do all those things don't naturally lend themselves to an ability perhaps to doubt or to stop and pause or reflect or to question. But I think that's something that's fundamentally important that we do, and that we challenge ourselves and hold ourselves to account to say, is our sense of purpose and ambition being matched by the outcomes that we actually deliver? As you know, I mean, the governor was at the event 5 years ago when we launched it. Pearson as a company have really tried to embed this whole idea of efficacy and outcomes into everything that we do. We reached a milestone last week with the first publication of our 17 externally audited reports. There's some really helpful insights, but there's no silver bullets, there's no easy, simple messages or headlines. What I think there has to be is this commitment from all of us, perhaps, to trust ourselves and trust each other, to be more open, more transparent, to learn and share what we find out as we make all these changes, partly because I think that's how we can then work more effectively with academia, education sector, with the public sector. Secondly, I think we'll win more support as profit-making organizations, that for-profit companies can be a fundamental force for good. But most importantly, I think it's the way we'll actually get a better return on the investments that we're making, because I gain greater confidence from all the work we're doing in efficacy from knowing that it's much more likely that the $1 billion a year that we're spending on the research and development of new products and services, we're learning, not guessing, as we make that investment. So I think combining the fantastic sense of purpose with a greater emphasis on outcomes and accountability is what we do well and what we could do better.
Yeah, and kudos to you and your organization for taking that progressive move, making that data transparent, the good and the what could be improved. Something that could probably be a learning lesson applied to many institutions that would bring about progress. So a slightly tougher question. So our economy is advancing rapidly. Some have called it the fourth industrial age, and in regards to technology, the second machine age. So what needs to happen to accommodate the modern learner in the context of this modern economy? And again, from each of your perspectives, John?
First? Yeah, so I mean, I think this whole debate was kick-started, wasn't it, about 5 years ago with that report, that the headline of which was that, 47% of all jobs in America were going to disappear to robots within 20 years. As a result of that, we commissioned a major piece of research with one of the co-authors of that report, Professor Mike Osborne, who's the Professor of Machine Learning at Oxford University, working with leading experts in the field, and we arrived at a much more nuanced and I think helpful and much more actionable report. It's online, I won't go into the details of it now. The big lessons I would take from it are, first of all, we should be digital optimists. At every stage of industrial change, go right back to the days of the Luddites and the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution, it's much easier to imagine and conceive of the jobs that will be lost and the jobs that will be created by technological change. So first of all, I think that let's be optimistic. Second, you cannot look at technological change in isolation from other big factors. Globalization. Look at the huge influx of Chinese pioneers and innovators here this week. Globalization, income inequality, urbanization, all these factors shape it. Third, it's not human or machine is a false dichotomy. It's about human and machine. It always has been and it always will be. And fifth, here's another false dichotomy. It's not knowledge or skills, it's knowledge and skills. People still need to know important things about the world in which they live, but they also need skills that perhaps previously we considered were the preserve of a liberal arts elite. Everybody now needs fluency of ideas, the ability to synthesize complex information, to problem solve, to persuade others of a point of view, to teach, to learn, to empathize, these things that make us uniquely human. And our challenge and task is deploying the power of technology to democratize that, to make that available to everybody and not expect them to come to us, but for us to break free of the constraints of physical campus and the like and actually get to where people are, because we're going to need to reskill, retrain, re-engineer, relearn, all of us throughout our professional and working lives.
Mm-hmm.
So as a computer scientist, I'm going to be a digital optimist. And an educator, I think that changing demand, changing interests is really an opportunity. So I see, first of all, that the projection or the thought that jobs and the way we live will change is really an opportunity for all of us to rethink what we're teaching. And when we rethink what we're teaching, that's a really good time to think about how we're teaching. So this plays into changing awareness and sophistication about pedagogy and applying new tools, digital tools and any tools of any kind to improve what we do. So I think there's a great deal of opportunity for us as educators to take the greater need for people across greater ranges of their lives and see that as a time that we can really reinvent what we're doing in a meaningful way. If there wasn't an interest in changing what people learn, we would have less motivation, less interest, less opportunity that way. And then a final point, I think, is that this second machine age, fourth industrial revolution, that's going to affect us also. And so we are not entirely disjoint and separated from the changing use of technology in the world and the way that people address information and process and learn with it. So we ought to think of adopting some of the trends that we see in broader areas in the way that we think about doing our jobs as educators.
Yeah, thank you. And piggybacking on your perspective related to technology, most know about Moore's Law. There is no Moore's Law equivalent for humans, and there's definitely no Moore's Law related to policy. So Bev, I invite you to answer this question with regards to both policy and your now current chapter in life, or in business, and how you see that.
I'm thinking about the comments. John, I'm a digital optimist too. The work I do in personal life learning is phenomenal across the country. And with you, John, I respect the work you do so much. I understand the comments have been made, what we learn and how we learn. From my perspective, the thing that keeps me up at night, and I hope some of you all are thinking about it, is who will be doing the learning and why the learning must take place. I'm out there, many of you are out there in communities and cities across the country, and I see real people who work hard, who go home and put food on a table and are working 2 or 3 jobs, or who just are so focused on their own lives and their families' lives. They don't have a clue what's coming down the chute. We go to all these meetings all over the world and we hear the same thing. 50, 60% of the jobs are going to be gone in the service industry. I look at real people walking down the street and I think your job's gone in 4 years. Do you have a clue what's about to happen to you and your family, to your mortgage payment and your car payment, and the chance for education for your kids? I think the most important, critical imperative in the country is for somebody to stand up, a leader, a group like you all, GSV, ASU, somebody to stand up and send the message out to the people, not to be afraid of what's going to happen, but at least for folks to understand that this is the first time in my life that there's ever been an imperative for adult learners to go back to the idea of learning and changing and retooling and innovating themselves. We can handle, I think, very well the younger people, and we can handle those now in initiatives for career or college training. I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about the 35-year-old, the 45-year-old, and the 55 and 65-year-old in this economy who needs to work and wants to work because it makes them better and happier, and they don't know. And I think it's our responsibility as thought leaders to at least work on putting that message out there in real people's English so real people can understand their life could very well be at risk unless they're prepared to change.
So we've covered some of the challenges. We've shared some insights. Clearly, these are all very complex issues that are shared amongst a number of very entrenched stakeholders. So in the frame of progress, how do we collaborate across public sector, private sector, academia, startup, innovation, in order to make real change, not just talk about it, but to do it and to make it stick?
Okay. I think this is a lot about, I think that colleagues here have talked a lot about the culture change, and your point about, digital change being exponential and human change being linear. I was at an event with 100 CEOs of, incumbents like Pearson, many of them many times bigger, who were leading their own digital disruption and transformation. And you ask 100 different CEOs what was the biggest single challenge they faced. Every single one of them said was the organization and cultural changes that they need to make inside their own organizations. And I think we all feel that in how we lead it and how we work with our partners and others to achieve it. And I was talking to somebody recently about this, and they made the point that hadn't occurred to me in quite these terms before, is if you make change far, distant, and vague, it's not surprising that people are frightened by it and disengage from it. If you can make change small, immediate, and specific, then you can engage people. So back to that debate about the future of work. If we say to college professors, instructors, teachers, that you need to prepare young people for jobs that don't exist in industries that haven't yet been created, what do they do with that in practical terms? Is it any surprise that they say, well, I'm going to carry on teaching my same courses in my same ways because that just all sounds too scary, too frightening, too intimidating to me? So I think this is quite a high-level answer, but my experience, whether it's working with our partners at Arizona State University and trying to expand their online program, whether it's working with Save the Children in the refugee camps in Jordan, or whether it's working with ministries of education around the world, the more immediate, specific, and actionable you can make it, the more we can help to make progress. And I think that's a sort of important lesson. That takes me back to this point about data, outcomes, learning, sharing, creating a learning ecosystem which is mutual and reciprocal, where we can all learn from and share with each other.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important.
And if I could just sort of throw it back at you, that's what needs to be done. How could academia support you? How could policy and or startup companies support you in that?
Well, I mean, I think by very much, as I say, working with, engaging with each other, being very open, being very transparent, by understanding our respective strengths, by sort of respecting each other's roles and intellectual property, but also having trust, perhaps to show, back to that point about showing some doubt, showing some vulnerability, be willing to say, well, this didn't quite work, but this is what we learned. That's what the best teachers do every day in the classroom, and that's the sort of behavior that I think we have to replicate in terms of the sort of more sustainable, trusting relationships that we need to build with each other and with our partners.
I mean, two ways you can try to move forward are grand challenges. I think we need some process for issuing the grand challenge. Somebody, some organization, some mechanism needs to put that forward. But a grand challenge that we all, or this half of the room got really behind, that would really change things. And another process really that's always effective is a pilot. Although pilots, you then have some challenges around the successful pilot trying to scale that up. And so I think those are two ways we could work together. And we could think about that as we walk off the stage, if not before that. One thing that occurs to me in thinking about what educational infrastructure, mostly I'm interested in higher education, but the same principles may appear otherwise, is we spend a lot of time competing with each other as institutions. And some of that effort is probably constructive. It helps us think about how to be successful and to, in some sense, competition can cause people to work harder and think about where there are specific opportunities and innovations. But there's 4,000 colleges and universities or more in the US and many, many more worldwide. And so some kind of partnerships among them seems like a pretty obvious thing to do. So if we had a grand challenge, some recognition of where we wanted to go, and some framework for us to get together, I would think from my perspective, at a Ivy League style institution, if we were to get together with a couple of large public research universities, a couple of community colleges, a couple of liberal arts four-year teaching colleges, a range of institutions, and take on a grand challenge together and then compete with another such team. I think that's a much more exciting sort of scenario than 4,000 food fights going on.
Exactly.
We all like a food fight, John. I love this conversation that we're having about collaboration and about how do you actually force the public sector into the formula. For years, you've had these great companies and you've had these marvelous institutions willing to do marvelous work with the public sector, but we in the public sector have been reluctant or hesitant. And I think that has to change. Last week, the NAEP scores just came out on America's kids, 4th and 8th grade. And if any of you read them and dug into them, you can see that America's flat. We're going backwards, so to speak. And children in disadvantaged neighborhoods or in disadvantaged families are falling further and further behind. Now, we know that the only way to attack the problem and the challenges for that specific community is using great academicians and great technology from the private sector. And so, again, to plug perhaps North Carolina, in North Carolina we did just that. We had a real problem with reading in K through 3. And we did an initiative called Read to Achieve, where I went out on a limb and hired a technology company. It was the first time in the history that we'd ever done that in the state, many for the first time in the country. And we spent millions and millions of dollars on this chance, this risk to teach kids to read. Now, it was high risk for me, but high reward for the folks in my state. It was really high risk for the business, because everybody everywhere was watching to see if they could succeed or if they'd fail. And it was high risk for the universities that we brought into the equation, because we knew at the end of the day we couldn't let Johnny get up and read to 1 million people. So we had to have the data, the real data, the in-time data. It worked in North Carolina. Democrats and Republican administrations have bought into it. It's gone on for now 11 years. So for me, that was the first instance where I sat back and realized the public sector, even folks who've been in the Department of Education for 30 years, can't do this work. We don't have the expertise. The states don't have the expertise. You need to bring in companies and business leaders, people like you all, with the ideas and innovations to address real problems in real time in communities across the country. And then you've got to have the academic support, the great thinkers and the great data producers to show us if what we're doing. So we too have efficacy in the work being done in the public sector. Most of the time, you pay your tax dollars and all you can see is the junk on the road. You don't think they're being well spent. Maybe it's time somebody challenged the public sector to do efficacy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Governor. So far we've covered some context. We've outlined what we think are some of the grand challenges, some insights and proposed solutions, including collaboration across important stakeholders. And so, lastly, I'm curious to hear everyone's thoughts on the important yet elusive question of scale. I'm reminded of a William Gibson quote, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." So the assumption I'd like everyone to agree with me on, just for the sake of this point, is that we already know so much about what is working properly and what is not, to some degree, but just let's agree for the sake of this conversation. How do we simply take what we know and scale it?
I'll start. Again, from the field, from the level playing field. We all know that the advent of digital learning and the availability of technology and connectivity and devices and computers in the homes are critical in America and around the world. You go to Africa and you see these communities who are desperate for connectivity and desperate for the devices, and folks are reaching out to help them. I go into some of the communities in America and wish that the country as a whole would decide we're in the 21st century, we know what's happening with the workforce. Why in the world aren't we being sure that there's connectivity in every nick and cranny of this country? So for me, that's the big thing. Thank you all. I think it's just true. And the second thing for me is make sure every kid has a device. Again, the NAEP scores. The NAEP scores were really lower in the disadvantaged kids' scores. I wonder if it's because it was the first time they took them on a tablet. You know, they perhaps don't have the same practice that many of our children have. So I think connectivity and availability of the devices and the technology will empower people to then work to address this future. Brad, I don't think you can scale it otherwise. I do not believe that in America we can scale this opportunity you're having these two gentlemen talk about until we have access and connection in every home and in every business in the state, all the states and in America.
Scale's a very tricky issue here. My own personal history around this has to do with the creation of the MOOC movement down my hall in the computer science department at Stanford. Several companies and nonprofits and other efforts started from that group of people. And I think what we learned there were two things. One thing that was not as evident to me at the beginning as well, and to that is the absolutely huge demand for learning. There are people out there anxious and crying for opportunities to learn and improve themselves. The simple idea that we could take our pedagogical model of the lecture course and scale it by putting cameras in lectures and broadcast those, and that would be meaningful learning for everyone, that was extremely naive. I think we should credit everyone involved with being idealistic and generous and committed to positive change, but also own up to the fact that was naive in a number of different ways. I think if you look at a successful lecture course at any campus, it involves a lot more than the lecture, and many of those other parts are important. We don't really know how to scale those in the same way. So it's clear that there's a tremendous need, several orders of magnitude, larger demand than supply. Simple methods that are technology only don't seem to be effective. In my mind, it's largely a pedagogy and learning model problem, not a technology problem. The technology involved is easy to build and straightforward. We just don't know how to use that effectively. And finally, I don't see that we're going to get to scale in a uniform, top-down, here's the method sort of way. The need for learning is as diverse as there are walks of life. And so there are many different kinds of organizations, institutions, individuals who can contribute. It may be that in the future, colleges and universities and structured educational programs are going to be central and key, but it may be that there are going to be other ways. If you think of all the things you want to learn over the course of your lifetime, how many of them have to come from a structured educational program? So I see scale as coming about through recognition of tremendous demand, through use of a variety of tools, through increasing pedagogical sophistication and increasingly effective learning science. And the business model and the financing is just tough. So I'll leave you the last 90 seconds here.
Okay.
So you'll help us there.
Two things. If you go to any community, any inner city, any rural area, anywhere in the world, everybody knows where the good school is or the good university, and there's always at least one. And if you walk into that, you will find three things. You'll find an enlightened leader. You'll find an expectation that every child, every student, every person in that organization has the capacity to learn. And you'll find that the culture of learning starts with the leadership and the teaching faculty. And there's a willingness to learn from and share and engage with each other. And I think that's what, to scale, that's what we need to bring to private sector organizations, to universities around the world, to government organizations. So I think that's the first point. The second point is, I'd say that we are just in the foothills of what this industry and this sector is capable of doing. So far, the most scalable solutions, for example, in higher education, have really been about automating the setting and marking of homework and providing some fairly basic personalization and adaptive learning. We are now combining the learning sciences, the cognitive sciences, machine learning, all the data that we've collected over the last decade or so about how people learn, capable of doing something much more exciting, much more challenging, and that's around this whole idea of authentic assessment, which really does break out the privilege of that liberal arts education and make it scalable and shareable for everybody. That's the truly disruptive thing that we can do now, and none of us can do that in our own. We'll do it by co-creating, co-developing, working together, and that's, I think, is the most exciting thing we can all be working on.
Well, thank you for your contributions today and more generally as leaders in the field. I think our time is up. It's been a pleasure and hopefully of value to everyone here.
Good morning, everybody. So it's my true pleasure and privilege to introduce my good friend Dan Rosenzweig, the chairman and CEO of CHEG. Dan is a seasoned internet executive, formerly being president of Ziff Davis and president of Yahoo. He also did a gig as a private equity investor before joining Chegg. I think basically when we started the summit in 2010. So under Dan's leadership, Chegg has been transformed into an incredible power in the education space. Publicly traded, as I mentioned last night, Chegg was up 141% last year alone, and now has a $2.5 billion market value. So with no more, I think you're in for a treat. Buckle up your seatbelts. I think Dan's going to take you for a ride. Thank you.
Morning. Well, that's nice. Dan Rosenzweig, got a lot of slides, got a lot of data, so let me just jump right into it. But I really appreciate GSV, Mike Moe, Deborah. When we came together for the first time, I was the first keynote speaker they had, which is why I think I continue to get these gigs. There were 35 of us in the ASU cafeteria, Mike, myself, and 20 people who were serving the food. So what's nice is that the education industry has grown dramatically and people understand the consequences of what we're talking about. So my gratitude for everybody who's trying to participate and make a difference. I want to talk about reinvigorating the middle class, and I'll explain in a second because I think we all agree that the middle class is disappearing in this country, and the path to the middle class has historically been learning and will forever be learning. So Americans are feeling under attack. It doesn't matter who you voted for, but I think everybody feels that we're under attack from something in our lives. So whether or not it's income inequality or the fear of globalization, which has led to tribalism, that the rich are not only getting richer, but they're getting access to things that ensure their success, while the rest of the world doesn't get access to those things, particularly in America. You can see it by the conferring of degrees. And that technological change is now not something that's abstract. It's in our lives. And we're beginning to feel the consequences of it, good and bad. And I think watching my friend testify before Congress last week, we understand the good and the bad, and that there are challenges to any choices that we make right now. So why Chegg? Mike mentioned our market cap, but that's not the reason that we get the opportunity to talk. It's because we reach more students and know more about them than anybody. Just to give you a sense of our scale at this point, when I first spoke at GSV, all we did was rent textbooks, and we had very few customers. Today, we had 4 billion page views of our content read last year, exclusively online. We have well in excess of 8 million students registered with us, which means we have a relationship with them on a day-to-day basis. 10 million people visit our site every month. And then our digital subscription services, which are not required, have grown 360% over the last couple of years. So we're in a good position to understand the needs, the interests, the voice of the student. And we've been given the opportunity in just the last couple of years, we've talked about things that have come to fruition. But we were ahead of the curve in knowing it because we had the data. We had the student, we had the knowledge, we had the communication. So we talked as far back as 2015 about the skills gap. And now, if you look at the value of the companies that are going, Pluralsight's going public. General Assembly got sold this week for nearly $500 million. Flatiron got sold for hundreds of millions of dollars. Everybody's looking to reinvigorate and re-educate because there's a clear skills gap, and we'll explain why in a little bit. That higher education, we said a couple of years ago, was in a bubble. I don't think most people believe me. We said all the trends of what a bubble is, right? Raising prices, cutting investment, market shrinking, all of those are things that indicate a bubble, and we are that tulip, right, from Holland. So the bubble burst. Last year we talked about rebooting the American dream, understanding the importance of immigration and the fact that in order that people who come here, they want to live the same American dream that we've always thought, but we're not giving that to them. And this year, if we made a mistake in the previous years, is that we talked about things but didn't really even understand ourselves, that the moment has already passed, meaning this has already happened. We're not waiting for this to happen. People are living the consequences of the choices we've chosen not to make. And so now we're talking about the way to save this country is to reinvigorate the middle class, and we are all part of that effort to reinvigorate the middle class. So if you ask the people running the schools, this is how you know the bubble has burst. This is how you know we're in deep trouble. These are the college presidents. 69% of them said more than 5 colleges will close this year alone. I think the real bid ask is something like half the colleges may shut down in the next 10 or 15 years. 47% of them, these are the people that actually look at the P&L. And if you don't think these are businesses, I don't care if you label yourself for-profit or not-for-profit, you're all businesses. You all have top line, you all have bottom lines. Okay? 47% of them are worried about the financial stability of the institution they run. Holy cow, right? That would be a company delisted from the public markets. And 82% of the colleges, now not the top 100 colleges where maybe perhaps your kids go or my kids were fortunate enough to go, but 82% of college presidents don't even feel they're going to fill this year's enrollment, which means everybody keeps saying the higher education industry is shrinking. That's our fault. That doesn't have to be true, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Last year, we sort of laid out the fact that every industry, education included, has changed over the course of its life. And it's always looked at a few variables in which to change for. Geographic considerations. Where's the population going? Who is that population? Economic and demographic needs. What are the financial situations? What are the kind of businesses that are in that community? So community colleges popped up. Agricultural colleges popped up. Industrial colleges popped up. But for the digital age, who is that? What is the model? What are we doing to acknowledge when the digital age is here? It's been here for 20 years. It's faster, it's more ruthless, it's more painful than anything else we've had to deal with. And it's global in nature, and we've gone from a country that had borders and boundaries to a world where everybody's competing for the same opportunities that we are. Even the government has tried to help improve education. And if you look from the 1965 Higher Education Act, the goal was to get more people into the system. Remember that? Let's get more people in. The problem was we got more people in, but not that many people got degrees. And if you actually look at who got the degree, 75% of people who have higher income graduate. Only 25% of people with lower income graduate. And so this is what happens when you graduate. You graduate with $37,000 in debt. You're likely to make 3 times as much as the person that didn't graduate, and there's an 80% chance that the job you're in may still exist in the next 15 years. May still exist. So it's still a better outcome, but it comes with a lifetime of indentured servitude to the government. 43% of college students, people that enter college, do not graduate. You know, there's 88 million people in our workforce today that have partial degrees out of 318 million Americans. Think about that percentage. That's a whole bunch of people. There's 44 million people that have borrowed $1.4 trillion for the right to not complete the system. Not sustainable. Those who don't finish, they also have debt. They earn 1/3 as much as the person who finishes, and latest information shows that within 18 years, 55% of the jobs that they are in are gone. So we're actually saying, come into a system, borrow money, and then go down a dead-end path. Anybody here want that for their children? I don't even want that for my enemies. Okay, maybe one of them. And I won't tell you who. So this is how it works. This is the bad math. There are 16 million students approximately in high school. 45% of them either drop out or don't continue on to college. Of those that do, you see 37% of them don't graduate. And 44% of those that go through the system, that do all the work necessary to go through the system, claim they're in a job that didn't require a degree anyway. So if you don't understand the sense of urgency, then you're probably at the wrong conference. Because I think we all come here because we want to do something about this. If you opt out of the system, at least there was a safety valve. There were jobs to go into. Many of us did some of these jobs. The problem is these jobs are going away. A couple of years ago, I was an early investor, fortunately, in Uber, and I thought, this is great. This is a great way for young people to make money and drive. Now they want autonomous cars. Doesn't matter how many people they kill, they just don't want to have a driver. So there is no safety valve now for those that are not getting the right learning to be a participant in the future. The economic disparity has only been widening. I don't think this should surprise anybody. There's still a better outcome if you go through. It's just not a very good outcome for most of us. But if you don't go through, we know where this leads. And we had an entire presidential election on bringing back jobs that may or may not be able to come back because of the fear of this, because of the denial that technology is going to do what it does whether we want it to or not. So why is this happening? These are just the samples of the fastest growing jobs. Now, what you probably don't know much is that we use computer learning and AI. We've read over 100 million college resumes for jobs over the last 10 years and over 2.5 million job descriptions over the last couple of years for hiring people. And so we use statistics and data not only from ourselves but for independent research to show you where the growth is. So if you don't have the skills to do these, you're not going to get that job. I don't know why we should even bother to deny it anymore. So what do we think based on the research we've seen? We think it's time to realign. And to do that, we need to serve the needs of the modern student. Now, yesterday I had the opportunity to sit in a very interesting panel with publishers and content creators, and one of them, Brian Napak, made a statement which I think is very true, which is, how are we supposed to do our business if we don't even know who our customer is? And by the way, I said earlier, we are like businesses, and we are, which is we have multiple constituencies, we have investors, we have shareholders, we have customers. It's no different than businesses. So who is the modern student? This is a comparison of 1970 to today. The last panel talked about going out and speaking to the people in the communities and realizing they're making different choices in their lives because they have to, and we're not taking that into consideration. This is an affirmation of that point. They are older, they are substantially more minority, they are overwhelmingly female now. This is the statistic that you really need to understand. They are working more than 30 hours a week while attending school, in their minds, full time. And even if they go to a community college, it's an hour commute, an hour home, and an hour for the class, so half a day worth of work is gone. Take one class. It's almost tripled the percentage of people where English is not their first language. If I took this out to 2022, that 11% would go to 25%. This is the future of America. This blew me away because I just had 2 daughters finish college, but 26% of college students already have children. Thank goodness. So if they're older, if they have children, if they're working, are we set up to serve them? Well, the next thing we need to know is, why do they go to us at all? So I appreciate learning for learning's sake. And I would bet that the majority of young people, if they weren't poor, if they didn't need to work all the time, if they weren't raising families, if they weren't supporting their own families, would love that opportunity to learn for learning's sake. But they're learning because they want to be a positive participant in our economy and our country. That's why they do it. And we screw them. 85% want a better job, 73% they're doing it for money. So why do we deny that that's why they come? And if that's why they come, why aren't we teaching them that? What's interesting is, here's the statistics that really made it come home for us. Why don't they come? Why do high school kids don't bother to go to higher education? Or why do 40% or more drop out of college? Well, when you add it all up, the primary reason is we gave them a choice. You either learn or you earn. You either enjoy reading or eating. We schedule our programming at the least convenient time for their lives. Does that make sense going forward? We don't wait for a car anymore in the rain. The car comes to us. We don't wait on a line to pay $19 to see a movie. The movie comes to us. This is still the only industry where we force people to pay a lot of money to come to us, when it's absolutely impossible for them to make that choice. Did you all read this last week, this research study? 36% of people that actually take the plunge to go in say they're hungry while they're there. That's unconscionable. These are the people, imagine the people who didn't come because they would have been worse off. But 36% of college students today say they're hungry. It's impossible to learn when you're hungry, but if the choice is earn or learn, that's a Sophie's choice. Which one do you make if you're a young person? We're not talking about the kids or the wealthy. That's not their choices. Their choices are, do I go to this great school or this great school? But you know what? Having an older white guy who's with money tell you this doesn't do anything. Let's listen to the voice of the students themselves.
Are today's modern students seeing the value between learning and earning?
The biggest struggle in my life is definitely finances. It's something that I am constantly thinking of. My debt and my loans, it's a huge weight on my shoulders at all times. It's the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning. It's the last thing I think about when I go to sleep. I am currently in over $100,000 in debt.
I think student loans I still have are probably around like $60,000.
$10,000 or $15,000 from undergrad and about $50,000 from grad.
I think about 10,000 right now.
If I had to go to school entirely on a student loan, it'd probably back me away from it.
I do not want to be stuck with a student loan looming over my head.
I mean, one thing I think about now that I'm in my last semester is the fact that if I had gone through with my original choice to go to University of Maryland, I'd probably be like $80,000 in debt right now, and that's an easy number to throw around when you're a senior in high school and you don't really care. You just want the hoodie and you want to tell your friends where you're going. But at this point in my life, right after I graduate, that would have been crippling.
75-80% of the people I knew had part-time jobs while they were at school.
So you're a full-time caregiver? Do you do 40 hours a week?
I do 60 plus.
60 plus, and is that all just so you can get an education?
Yeah.
I currently do a full 40 hours of work, and I'll be doing about 12 hours of schooling starting in the summer.
I guess when you see student loans, it makes you think of regret if you didn't get the job you want.
Coming out of school, I also had the idea in my mind that I would be set, ready to go, ready to enter the working world, but it's not as easy and smooth of a transition as I had assumed.
I see it changing from a system of trying to build future leaders and future intelligent people to just being a mill of a rite of passage and just being something that you do.
The educational part has been good, but it hasn't helped me as much as I maybe thought it would, but it gives people proof that I'm able to learn.
I took a lot of general education classes like the first 2 years probably, and I felt that was kind of unnecessary because that didn't really help me.
Especially in my early years, a lot of what I learned was self-taught. So the professors would assign projects, but I would learn the most from using resources on the internet.
Just because you're 28, 35, it doesn't mean it's too late for you. I'd still say you go for it, but make sure you're aware of the money that it costs and how long it may take you to get a job after, Realize that school is not necessarily putting a job in your hand when you're done.
So they're optimistic, but it can be pretty depressing. And I don't know if any of you got to New York and saw Springsteen on Broadway. I'm a little bit of a freak. I've seen Bruce 78 times. But the first part of the show, he goes through his history of his life and growing up and the difficulties with his father. And then he said, okay, the Suicide Watch part of the show is over now. So the Suicide Watch part of this presentation is over now. Let's flip to the other side. This is not Mission Impossible. But we will not do anything about it unless we embrace the fact that these are different people than we were. They have different needs. They have different time constraints. They have different economic situations. They speak different languages. And they are our future. And we got to stop believing that someone else is going to change it. We have to do this. So it's not mission impossible. But let's flip it around on the positive side. Let's do this like a venture capital pitch where we make everything up. What if I told you that we could educate 3 times as many students as we do today? What if I told you we could make it less expensive for them, more relevant for them, more productive for them, help them get a better job, reduce their debt, reduce the time? The company that reduces the time from learning to earning becomes one of the most valuable companies in the world. If I told you that opportunity was available and we could have more educators and pay them more, who would sign up for that? Okay, you're all venture capitalists now. So thank you for that. So we had you listen to the student about what their life is like, and we showed you the statistics of what they told you about what their lives and their challenges are. We should also listen to them about how to educate them. The stats are pretty significant and pretty real, and I don't know why anybody even doubts it anymore or pretends like there's a better way to do it. 55% of students use smartphones in addition to their laptop in the classroom. 60% of students believe that digital learning tools has already improved their grades, and 47% of the students have already used online homework help. So in other words, 1 out of every 2 students is doing what we should be doing for them anyway, whether you want them to or not, or whether you think it's a good idea or not, or whether you know how to do it or not. So we believe it's time to sort of reimagine, this again, venture capital pitch, reimagine, change the world. I can use all the good buzzwords, AI, all that stuff. Who we serve, we already told you now. It's different. What they need, they already told you. They want a job. Why they come? They come to earn more money. And now you see the statistics on where they engage. So if we really think that the most important constituent in our ecosystem is the student, why don't we act that way? It's not the educator, it's not the administration, it's the student first, and then the employer. Because like it or not, they only are using us to get there. We're the middle of that Oreo, okay? So what would happen, this is what happens when you don't put the student first. 85% students say they go to get a job, 23% of 4-year college presidents in the private schools say that it's not their job to get you a job, and 66% of employers say that you don't have the skills to get the job. And we keep raising the prices, making it harder to get the class and make it less convenient to go. So what's the point? Now, I heard last panelist say it's hard for people to imagine the future. So this is from the World's Fair in the 1900s. This is how they imagine the future. And other than a horse walking across water, I'm not sure what they invented from the 1900s. But what we're saying is it's not hard to imagine our future because we're already 20 years past it. All we have to do is look at what we do in our own lives. And technology is relentless. Like it, don't like it, it doesn't stop. It screws up, it comes back at you. Right? We all thought we dodged a bullet when the MOOCs didn't work the way they were supposed to the first time out. Told you they wouldn't work. Well, technology is relentless. Look at the comments about the phone or the light bulb or the iPhone. All of you are on your iPhones right now. So I know the keyboard must work. So it's easy for people to come up and tell you what you should do, but we've lived it. So I don't normally talk a lot about Chegg, and I don't plan to here, but I just want to point out that only in 2013, only 4.5 years ago, we were 80% an analog business. All textbook revenue, no digital relationship with our customers, rent, return, rent, return. That was it. And we had a no-growth business with no profits, and we had a huge need for cash. Sound like a college? Because we were investing in hardware, not software. When we made the switch to invest in software, our revenues went down, our stock price went down, my drinking went up. So there are consequences to these choices. But look what's happened. Last year, we had 440 million content views on our online educational service that is not required. 69% growth year over year. We have 20 million questions already asked and answers from students that educators are teaching that are already in our database. We answered over 6 million new ones last year in less than 4 hours from our network of 35,000 experts that we were able to build. And this is the other thing you need to understand. The primary time where students learn is 9 p.m. It's not during the day, and it's not because they were hanging out on the quad watching lacrosse. They were working their butts off trying to pay for what it is we're supposed to be giving them. So if you know they're willing to come online, and you know the time of day that they're willing to work, and you know that they're dying to be educated, we can't call them lazy, because they're not. This evidence proves it. So our view is this: we got to stop looking at ourselves as an industry that isn't like every other industry. We are businesses. For-profit, not-for-profit, we have revenue, we have profits. We try to raise one, cut the other, right? We need to produce cash flow. 47% of college presidents don't believe that their businesses will even survive based on their financial insecurity. So we did not make this path up. We followed some really smart companies. So Adobe, which I'm very grateful to be on the board of, they were a packaged software company that delivered through multiple channels, that made a new product every couple of years. And they were going out of business because people believed that content creators were diminishing, because print companies were going away, newspapers were going away, television's going away, their customers were going away. Their CEO made a bold choice. Screw it, we think there's going to be more content creators. They went all digital, they went into the cloud. They estimated that they could grow all the way to 8 million customers, where they've already surpassed 12 million. When you make your products more relevant, more convenient, more affordable, more people come into the market. Netflix, look at their revenue growth over Disney's growth. This may shock you, but as of this morning, Netflix is only $10 billion less in value than the entire Disney company. And when I first met Reed, when I was at Yahoo, his company was worth what my company was worth a year and a half ago, which was $500 million, because he was renting DVDs. He was in that business. Now he's in a pure digital business. Look what's happened. Look what happens to companies that don't. This is what's happening to us. We're still valuable, but the new companies eat our lunch. Mark Andreessen said, software is eating the world. We keep investing in hardware. New gyms, new dorms, new this, new that. How about new curriculum? How about new ways to serve that curriculum? How about new people to serve it to? That's software. We keep investing in hardware. Look what happens. Which would you rather be? The winners all have certain characteristics. Their brands are known for something. If I say you're going to watch a movie, you're going to tell me you go to Netflix. Search, Google. I can go through all the names. What is your college relevant for? Do you own the customer? You may have a business relationship with the customer, but do you own them? Do you own their data? Do you know who they are, what they do, and how they do it, when they're struggling, what they like and what they don't like? That's why data matters. We have more data on more students than anybody. I can tell you on every single college campus which classes students struggle with, which textbooks they struggle with, which ones they do well with, because I have all that data. Our penetration in some of these campuses, Arizona State University is one of them, as high as 36%. So yes, we know this. We own our own distribution channel. We can go directly to the student. We can change it. If we own our content, we own our brand, we own our channel, we can make the content better instantly and for less. Why aren't we doing that? Here's what happens when you don't. Here's what happens when you do. Which would you rather be, Netflix or the movie theater? The movie theater, hardware, not software. Look at the difference in the amount of content consumed. We think educational institutions are just like this, which is you can produce more content, make it more convenient, make it more available, make it more affordable, make it more diverse. You can do this because education is like entertainment. It's more content creators creating more content of different kinds for more diverse audience. This model exists. Higher education is already sampling this with graduate programs online. Many of you use those companies and they're great. Now the motivation is both forward-thinking and financial. How do I not cannibalize my existing undergrad business and build a new revenue stream? And it's working. But it also acknowledges that because students are older, because they don't have time to commute because they're at work, that they want to remain working at the time, that they preparing students to get a different kind of job, and physical constraints to the classroom. We can't build an on-site graduate program. These are all the characteristics that cause us to do these online for graduate degrees. Why not do it for undergraduate degrees? The same things hold true. They're older. They can't come to us. We need to go to them. We need to make it more diverse. We need to do it at night. We need to do it when it's more convenient. Graduate programs online have shown us the way of what we need to do for undergraduate programs. So we believe it's time for undergraduate programs to catch up. Today, limited classes, fixed times, right? Fixed locations, limited number of educators. What did we hear yesterday? 1.2 million of our educators are adjunct professors, also starving, going from school to try to teach. We can eliminate all of the unnecessary time constraints and costs by going more digital and more online. And yes, if we cannibalize our business, so what? Because we won't have one to cannibalize in 10 years. So you can fix the things that the students say, that the 75% of the students that don't go that should tell you that if you fix, they would. And so we can all get Netflix for $10 a month when it costs us $18 to go to a movie theater, that you have to wait in line to go see a movie you don't likely want to see at a time that's incredibly inconvenient with popcorn that makes you feel like crap after you eat it. Instead of just sitting at home and watching what you want and eating kale. Okay, my wife's a vegetarian. It's a problem for me. I'm dealing with it. Okay. I hate the label 4-year college or 2-year college. Why do they take whatever time they need to take? If you can binge watch Billions, you can binge watch college. So, we end with this. It is not too late to reinvigorate. The middle class has to be rebuilt. The only way we can rebuild it is acknowledging who the young people are, what the constraints are in their life, fit into their lives rather than ask them to fit into ours. And if we do that, we can grow the pie by 75% or 3x. So who's with me if we do that? Thank you very much for listening.